Before I introduce Father Greg, remember I promised you that second video, the one that we started by mistake at the beginning. And this video is about the importance of affinity groups, that in order to feel safe to explore the less savory aspects of our lives and ourselves, it's really important to be able to be in a situation that feels safe and supportive. And so we have developed affinity groups, and we have a short video to show you about them. And I also want to say, it's also important that the affinity groups talk to each other. And that's the next step. But first, the video.
In a world where people from marginalized groups continue to be targeted, we need spaces for people to come together and practice and heal from the harms we face.
Meditation begins to give us an avenue through which we can explore our conditioning. For those of us who belong to marginalized communities, it might show up as internalized oppression. So through meditation, we can begin to look clearly at our internalized oppression and to begin to tend to it with compassion and with love toward ourselves, so that eventually we can celebrate our uniqueness.
The POC space is very instrumental in creating a whole person that does not have to give up who they are or what they know or where they come from.
It's so important to have spaces where people can come together and share stories of empowerment and resilience in the face of adversity. And we also need spaces where we can unpack feelings of shame and unworthiness so that we can really love our full selves. This year, Inside LA made history by offering the first ever residential retreat for transgender and gender variant people.
In the 20 years since I've transitioned, I've never been in such a specifically healing and restorative place. We're rarely afforded the opportunity to explore a spiritual or healing or meditative or contemplative place as the one that was created specifically for us.
Being queer often is an experience of being invisible, although there are those of us who are hyper-visible. Sitting with people and being led by people who understand your life experience is an experience that lets you actually be seen, to be trusted, to be proud of who you are.
We need your support to continue offering these affinity groups that provide deep healing and transformation. Your donations also go towards financial support for people from marginalized groups, as well as those in financial hardship. Please consider making a gift today.
So again, we really thank you for your support, for being here, for lasting even though there are no breaks. My sister was here and she said, "Whoever heard of not having a break?" And so we never have breaks. This is a situation where moment to moment we keep practicing, including when we go upstairs to use the restroom. Anyway, the affinity groups are a really important part of our community, and the hope is that everybody can find a place where they feel that they belong and can just be who they are fully and freely. And I have to also just say that I'm so proud of our team at Inside LA that has created all of this. Our team of teachers, our admin team in the office, our director, Mark Coburg, our deputy director, Martin Vitorino, who was in the video. Mark was in the first one. And just feeling enormous gratitude and joy to celebrate all that you have accomplished. And now I would like to, in fact, it is my huge honor to introduce Father Greg and many, yes. So Father Greg, as most of you know, is a Roman Catholic priest in the Jesuit order and the former pastor of Dolores Mission Church in Los Angeles. He is the founder and director of Homeboy Industries, which is the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. It's sort of like one huge, large affinity group, as far as I can tell. And in the face of law enforcement tactics and criminal justice policies of suppression and mass incarceration, as a means to end gang violence, and we know how well that has worked, Father Greg and parish and community members adopted what was, again, a radical approach at the time, just as IACT did with the refugees. They decided to treat gang members as human beings and talk to them about their aspirations and what they want and need in their lives. So in 1988, they started what became Homeboy Industries, which we now see at the airport and other places, and trains former gang members in a variety of enterprises so that they can have a better life. And they've served thousands of women and men who've walked through their doors, who've had the courage to walk through their doors. And I want to encourage you to read Father Greg's books, the 2010 book, Tattoos on the Heart. The subtitle is The Power of Boundless Compassion, and it is a Dharma book. It is a book of beautiful spiritual teaching. And it was followed by his second book called Barking to the Choir, The Power of Radical Kinship. And they are both really good books that provide really good teaching stories if you're in that business. So Father Greg has received the California Peace Prize. He's been inducted into the California Hall of Fame, and President Obama named him a champion of change. So I want to welcome, please, Father Greg. And so what's going to happen now, we don't know. The three of us are here, and we're going to have some conversation together and with you. And let's go. I'm sitting in the middle, but I'm not the moderator of this. We're doing this together. We have some questions that we can always ask you, Father Greg, but I just want to invite you if there are any words you'd like to say to begin with. You don't have to, but...
Oh, well, then no. I'll take your lead.
Just make yourself comfortable, please.
I know.
I'm going to...
I do have to say that years ago I was interviewed by Krista Tippett at this at the Chautauqua Institution, and I told her I had this reoccurring nightmare that I would be interviewed by Krista Tippett and that I would be found spiritually shallow and wholly unenlightened. So I had the same nightmare with Jack and Trudy, so... because they're my heroes, they're my teachers. So
it's completely mutual. We actually I met Krista Tippett for the first time at the retreat where we just taught, the annual retreat with Ram Dass. And I felt absolutely starstruck when I met her. The same. Do you know who Krista Tippett is? Yeah. For those of you who don't, she Years ago, decades ago, I think the beginning of this 21st century, started a program called Speaking of Faith on the radio to address spiritual issues and have some dialogue across traditions. And then, I guess about, I don't know how many years later, changed the title to On Being. So the radio program is called On Being. And she invites a wide variety of guests onto her program and just has these very beautiful conversations with them. How did it go?
Oh, it's great. I mean, she's a kind of a national treasure. You know, if you haven't heard her, she's quite wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
May I ask you a question? And, you know, it's probably been asked to you before. It's not a softball question at all. And it's very much related to that conversation that the Dalai Lama and Tutu had. But knowing your work and also reading what you write about, you're close up to so many deaths. People, you know, this undeclared war in the streets, basically. You're there seeing the injustice of this kind of racist poverty prison complex that, you know, our society has created. Serving, how do you keep from being overwhelmed by it? How do you keep your spirit going? And actually, how do you keep your sense of humor?
Well, you know, I buried my 231st young person killed because of violence in the street 3 weeks ago. But last Saturday, I buried a young man, we all called him Speedy. His name was Caesar. And I'd known him 33 years. And he died of an overdose, which is actually happens a lot. And so, but you know, you reflect on him, and he was just this force of nature. It's like he knew this thing, you know, that self-absorption was the place of sadness, and that being focused on the other was really where happiness resided. But being loving was what he did, and he knew that that's where joy was. So I think that's sort of the key. I mean, I'm kind of weird that way in terms of death, only because I've had to put it in its place, you know. And there was a homie named Moreno who I buried, but he had buried his older brother just 2 years before, and both gunned down in the streets. And he had said of his older brother's death, "Death is a punk." And I thought, yeah, you know, it is. And it seemed like if death is the worst thing that can happen to us, well, then you're going to be toppled by life itself. And he taught me that he knew how to put first things recognizably first and where to position death in the scope of things. And how can it be the worst thing that can happen to you if it's going to happen to everybody, you know? And so you have a light grasp on life, and you're anchored always in the present moment and the freshness of it. And you don't go anywhere else. You try to stay exactly right there. And it inoculates you from death, I think. Not from suffering, because you kind of let that in a different way, I think. But I'm weird that way, because I think I've had to do something else with death, because death is a thing that will happen to all of us. But death was a constant, especially in the decade of death, which was 88 to 98, when it was just, it just didn't stop. And it was kids I loved being killed by kids I loved. And that made it exponentially more challenging. But nonetheless, as long as you can kind of bring yourself back to delighting in whoever is in front of you at any given moment, I think it's just key. But there's a presumption that how do you do it? And I think a phrase that I have, like most things you steal from other people, is grim duty. I always say it's not a grim duty. And I got that from you because, and people presume that. That's their expectation, that this is a grim duty. And if it was, then nobody could do it. But if it's the source of eternally replenishing joy, because you're with people. Just right now, I did a quinceañera, and anybody know what that is? And of course, the homies were 20 minutes late. It was just classic. So I cut the fat out of the thing, because I knew I had to get here. And then I swung by the office and picked up Marissa from my office, who works at Homeboy. And there were these three homies who were kind of homeless and, so they came into my office and it was like a love fest, I said, how did I ever get so lucky to have the three of you as my sons? Oh no, we're the lucky ones. So they're going, and yet it was mutual and wonderful, and they're suddenly homeless, and we'll figure it out on Monday, and they'll figure it out until then. And how did I get so lucky? That's what I mainly think,
Do you feel that way, especially because you're working with kids, with young people, because they have a sense of humor? I think in the spectrum at Homeboy is 14 to 65, and especially now that we're having lifers who are being returned to the community. So they don't know a cell phone from One guy was telling me he didn't know how to get the water out of the, in the bathroom, because you put your hand under and it does it, and he was wondering where. And I thought, well, who thinks of that, But I took two homies with me to Sacramento, and we were going to speak at some schools, and I had masses and stuff, so it took late. So we didn't get there till dark. It was like 7:30. Carlos and Robert. And Carlos has big two devil's horns on his forehead. And, to his credit, he's growing his hair, and he's had some tattoo treatments, removing them at Homeboy. But they're still quite pronounced on his forehead. And so we get on the shuttle bus from the Terminal B at Sacramento Airport, and we're going to the rental car place. And it's a short distance. And so we get on the bus, and I'm here, and Robert's across from there. And at the back of the bus, Carlos plants himself. Well, I watch people assiduously trying to avoid sitting next to the guy with the devil's horns. And they just did it as best they could until they couldn't do it anymore because there were no more seats, and they sat next to him. And we were somewhere in midpoint between Terminal B and the rental car place, and this electric shuttle bus just shuts down. And we're kind of in the middle of a wooded, dark area. And all the lights went out. And for some reason, we're all silent, which kind of struck me odd that nobody was going, hey, come on, what's silence? And the driver's trying to get it going, and it's not working. And all of a sudden, from the back of the bus, Carlos says, I saw this in a movie once. It does not end well. Well, the whole bus just explodes in laughter. And, literally, it was the most unanimous thing in the most tribal time in our country, where I suspect we all had our camps, but suddenly kinship so quickly thanks to this guy with the devil's horns. And I suspect there was nobody after that moment who would have hesitated to plant themselves next to that guy.
And it had this effect on the whole bus that was palpable and unmistakable. And he did that. He is, the trustworthy guide to lead, the rest of us to kinship.
Thank you. I don't even know how to ask this, because what you do seems so integrated in a way, and there's a kind of personal religious life that people have, or that's promulgated in different ways. And then I know certainly in the church, and in I guess maybe it started in Latin America, liberation theology, there's the whole movement to, I think it's really reclaiming what was there from the time of Jesus to actually stand up against oppression, or to stand for those who are outcast in some way. So much of religion, in certain ways seems to focus on the individual, and yet what you're seeing in the work you do is also really structural. It's the society around and the way that we treat people who we somehow think are different. How do you put those together? How do we put those together? What would help us? Because we have both those sides and both those needs, of our own personal work, but also we're embedded in systems that are also causing a lot of suffering.
Yeah, I wish I was better at that. Other people are better at this than I am in terms of structural, somehow addressing these things at a higher level or aerial view. I think I'm not that good at it, frankly. You want to kind of be located at the margins because you have a gut sense that that's how they're going to get erased if you situate yourself out there. But then beyond that, it's hard for me to kind of strategize or address the structural thing. Sometimes I have an assurance that may not be well-founded, but it's that somehow if you do that, if you stand with the demonized so that the demonizing stops, that the demonizing stops. That if you stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away, that the day does arrive when we stop throwing people away. But it may be a cop-out, for me to, I should be thinking more strategically about how to structurally do things. But it's kind of not in my toolbox in a way. I mean, I will support people who are advocating in a way that I think, gets us there. But it feels more aligned with my own gifts, I guess, to kind of be just there. And that then you present a kind of a place that longs to be the front porch of the house everybody ends up wanting to live in. And so you're inviting people to a longing just by being there with the folks who are most discarded. And that kind of feels like the right place for me. But, I wish I was better on marrying those two things together.
Well, I see what you're doing as actually being a model for what's possible for people all around the country and around the world. So I do see both. And I think about it, because I'm also thinking about all of us, and is it your place to go and volunteer or work at Homeboys, or is it your place to do something else? The kind of things that Trudy was talking about inside LA doing. And I remember my friend Malidoma Somé, who's a West African shaman, medicine man, and I loved his image. He said, in the Dagara people, that's his people, he said, we believe that everyone who's born comes in with a certain cargo. And that's the metaphor, like the cargo ships that go up the rivers in West Africa. And your task in life is to deliver your cargo. And people have different cargo, which is to say they have different gifts.
Yeah.
So you're listening to what your gift is, which is to be called to be with the disposables and the dispossessed. And some of you, that may be your gift, or some of us. And for others, your gift may be to work in a political way or a structural way.
Right.
Or it may be, to work in an entirely different way. It might be in another whole part of the world. Or it might be to work with young children, and to raise children who see with the eyes of love in a way that who don't forget what they knew as children, who don't forget how to see with the eyes of love, because that's really what it is. It's not like you have to teach them, it's that you have to protect them in some way so they can still see that way. I mean, you work with kids for so many years, and that was one part of your gift, right?
I just remembered what it was like to be a child. I don't remember the specifics of each age, but I remember what it felt like to be each age. I want to ask you, did that front porch exist in your home? Did you find it in the church? Like that front porch that we all want to be on together. Did you grow up with it?
Yeah, probably. You talk about the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and everyone who walks through the doors at Homeboy is like a 9 or a 10. And people might say, well, 4 to 5 is kind of yikes. You may have trouble or health or socializing. Well, like I'm a 0 on the ACEs, But that doesn't make me morally superior to the folks who walk through our doors, quite the opposite. But that was part, I suppose, of my upbringing and kind of knowing what community was. And, but I think everything of value I've sort of learned at Homeboy, because it's enemies, it's rivals, it's races that are different, it's men and women. Everybody has kind of a shared, depth of trauma, of course. There's that poem by Jack Gilbert, the one about the forgotten dialect of the heart, and where he talks about it's probably poetic license or an exaggeration, but a people in northern India that was dying out because it had forgotten, it didn't have a word for endearment. And which is like a word or a gesture. And so Homeboy is just packed with that kind of like containers of tenderness. That somehow the delivery system of tenderness at Homeboy is so remarkable, especially as you stand in awe at what folks have had to carry. And you go, how have they pulled that off? Even when you're bumping into people, even when you're, doing the natural kinds of things that happen. Like not that long ago, I got a text from a homie named Chino, who I've known for many years. And a hard life and struggled and addiction and some undergirding mental health things. And he needs to go to rehab. So he texts me, this was just recent. He texted me and he said, AG, kick me down with some feria, which means money. And I said, you're my son forever, and I love you so much. And I will always help you, but I will only help you. So if I gave you money, this wouldn't be much help. You need to go to rehab. Come in on Monday, we'll get you into a rehab, we'll pay for it. I know you've burned all your bridges with family and friends, but you'll never burn this bridge between you and me. So I push send. Right away, he gets back to me. Fuck your bridge. Oh. Well, I remember it so fully. Like I just let the sting of it come over me. And then I shared it with my counsel. My counsel are all homies who run Homeboy Industries. And they all know this guy, and he's a character, you know. Then it became endearment. It became, they would leave my office, they still do it, and they hug me and they go, fuck your bridge. And I go, hey, thank you. And it's become this odd term of endearment. But it is the forgotten dialect of the heart, you know. It's like somehow it has to be word and gesture. It has to be. Otherwise, what's the container? How do you get the pulley system to go from your heart to somebody else's heart except by word and gesture? And he went to rehab, by the way, let me just say that. But
did he go on Monday?
What?
Did he come in Monday?
No, but we got him into a rehab without him coming in. Security was involved. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
It could be the title of your next book, Fuck Your Bridge.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a chapter.
Okay.
For sure.
In a way, you could say, you know, what you're doing is reminding people how to love. In another way, you could also say you're reminding people that they can trust. You know, that somehow that we can trust one another, and that that trust that may have been, you know, broken in all kinds of ways or lost. Yeah, how do we learn to trust as a world? I see it when I teach meditation. Sort of the first step is somehow to communicate to people that they can trust that their heart is big enough to hold their own human experience, all the joys and sorrows and so forth, that they can begin to trust that. And when they begin to trust that they can hold that, then it becomes possible to maybe trust to be able to hold someone else. Just interested in thinking about trust.
But the first stop and step in transformation, like in the affinity groups, is to have just a safe place. It's really a location. And at Homeboy, you know, I think people find the place like a sanctuary, if you will. You know, a homie said the other day, when you walk in there, there's an aroma. You know, and that's the aroma is really safety. It's really, you're okay here. We got you. And then people become the sanctuary that they sought. Then they inhabit that safety. And then they go home and they present that sanctuary to their kids. And for the first time, you've broken a cycle because safety all around.
Yeah.
This is a safe place that can be trusted. And it's a love that can be trusted, which, you know, that's kind of a key challenge, I think.
Yeah, I've seen it in working with vets who come back, who, especially to make a circle, a group for combat vets, and they'll say, you know, they haven't been able to talk about what happened to the people they love because it's too devastating to them and to the people that they, and they'll say, I can't tell you what I saw. I mean, you know this very well. But then it gets more difficult because then they say, I can't tell you what I had to do. You know, and then this becomes the first place that they can somehow take the weight that's been on their heart for all those years and say, here it is, and other people can say, we'll hold it with you. And somehow it sounds like that happens at Homeboys as people come in. Do they tell their stories, or is it more just that there's the field of love?
Well, there's that, but, you know, there's groups and there's therapy and so people, find their way to do that. But our groups are really quite healthy and whole, and they feel quite confident in sharing things that, I think that's a new thing, frankly. I mean, there had been a huge stigma to that kind of idea. I'm not going to tell people in a group anything. Certainly I'm not crazy. I'm not going to talk to a therapist. Sure. And that is gone. I mean, we have 4 paid therapists, 49 volunteer therapists, including 3 psychiatrists, and a waiting list for our trainees, which has never happened. So on the one hand, it's a good problem to have. It means that the stigma, which was pronounced my first 15 years easily, has been lifted, and not that that's the only, but we have meditation, lots of meditation possibilities and lots of mindfulness practice. So there's a lot of ways to to arrive at this, but the fact that they feel safe enough to disclose in those kinds of settings is quite remarkable, and it's a tipping point in as much as this just was not in my experience at all. My first 15 years of working with gang members, that was a closed door, and it just didn't seem it would ever open, and then it did.
Isn't that beautiful? The things that you don't think will change.
Exactly. Oh. And now I don't think it'll ever return to any other. That toothpaste is sort of out of the tube, I think.
One of the things that I've read about you doing, heard about whenever I've heard you speak, and you did it again here, I don't know if you were talking about Speedy, I forget which person, but you said he was the guide. He was your teacher. And it seems that you have a cultivated habit and ability to point out the strengths of the people in front of you without doing it in a gooey way, but just really pointing out what you're learning from them that they already know, the compassion or kindness or wisdom or bits of love that they are already manifesting, and that they don't see in themselves, but you see it and you point it out. So that the distance between whoever they think they're supposed to be and who they actually are gets smaller and smaller. And that also creates a feeling of safety. Do you see yourself?
Yeah, I think once I gave a talk in Houston, and a guy came up to me, a hardcore gang intervention worker, former gang member, tattooed, been to prison. Now he was working with gang members in Houston, and he kind of pleaded with me. He said, how do you reach them? Meaning gang members. And I found myself saying to him, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Mm-hmm. Can you be reached by them? And suddenly you've turned something on its head.
Right.
And now you're receiving people, which is a whole other stance, but it's not pretense, because it really is, that that's where the joy is. And that's why, I don't know, sometimes with staff at Homeboy, there's people can do this thing about I burnout, or I guess I'm just too compassionate. And if you go to the margins to make a difference, then it's about you. But if you go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different, well, now it's about something entirely different. And now it's eternally replenishing. And then burnout is not even an issue. So I sort of don't believe in depletion, because I think if you're being depleted, then you've allowed it to become about you, fixing, saving, rescuing. But the minute you allow yourself to receive, then that's the place. I just read this profile or whatever it was on Mr. Rogers in the New York Times Sunday magazine. Did you read that? And he says, if you're helping people, well, you're kind of in control. But if you're receiving people, then you're vulnerable. And I thought, it's very simple, but absolutely the truth. But it's kind of where the joy is. When allowing yourself to have your heart altered by folks who have carried things that I couldn't imagine. So you don't pretend like you kind of are superior, but I'm going to pretend like I'm not. No, it really is about the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God. The day simply won't ever come, and I'm okay with that. Then you can kind of rest in it and receive it and be vulnerable in it. And oddly, it's where the joy is, because then you can get to the place where you love being loving. And it's selfish because you're receiving and you're being reached. And every minute you're being shaped in ways by people who are the shape of God's heart. And I don't know. I wouldn't trade my life for anybody's.
Sure.